Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. is in conversation with Taylor Patterson and Dr. Lisa Compton. Taylor is an instructor in the counseling department at Regent University. She worked for several years as a mental health counselor at a nonprofit agency serving survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, and now sees clients in private practice, specializing in adults with a history of childhood trauma. She served as co-editor for Safeguarding Skills, a guide to preventing abuse and fostering healing in the church, a textbook for seminaries, parachurch ministries, and local churches, and has published in peer-reviewed journals. Taylor's research interests include interpersonal violence, compassion fatigue prevention and treatment, and trauma-informed counselor education and supervision. Dr. Compton is an associate professor and director of the PhD in Counselor Education program at Regent University. With over 29 years of experience in the mental health field, she is a licensed clinical social worker, certified trauma treatment specialist, and compassion fatigue educator. Dr. Compton has been a conference keynote speaker presented internationally on trauma-related topics and has been featured on CBN News discussing domestic violence and sexual trauma. She is the co-author of Preparing for Trauma Work in Clinical Mental Health and Safeguarding Skills, a guide to preventing abuse and fostering healing in the church. Her research focuses on secondary trauma and trauma pedagogy, with numerous published articles. A reminder, before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Hello and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr. Today I am pleased to be welcoming Dr. Lisa Compton and Taylor Patterson to the show. Hello, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us, Loren.
Yeah, so we'll try to do this well here with two people. I'm so used to one-on-one interviews, but let's start with Lisa. Share, if you would, about your faith background and journey, what that looks like today.
Sure. So my journey started with me, my friend Tammy, and Jesus. And when I was younger, I was not raised in a faith household, but I was introduced to Jesus by a friend at summer camp. And so I didn't go to church growing up. It was really just a personal faith. And then as I got into college, then it became something where I was going to Christian fellowship and churches. And so that's where the system of the church then was introduced. And I've been on staff at a church and work at a Christian university. So systems came later in my journey.
Taylor, how about you?
Yeah, the way I kind of describe it is I didn't have classically evangelical childhood. I didn't grow up in Sunday school or doing Bible drill. My dad was a professional minor league hockey coach growing up. So we were a little rough around the edges. We moved around a lot. And I started attending church kind of as a later adolescent. Was a goody two-shoes, really wanted to fit in. And so as I came to know Christ, I felt like I had a lot of catching up to do and a lot of kind of Christian imposter syndrome. And so I understood saved by grace through faith alone, but now I really, really have to earn my way into goodness in the church. And I feel like my faith in my adult life has been kind of this cyclical process of learning what it looks like to rest in the finished work of Christ. And a lot of that has come through proximity to suffering and suffering, other people's suffering, my own, and really wrestling with God and raising my fist to the heavens and him keeping me and holding me and learning what it felt like to feel safe with God, which has been really sweet.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I'm thinking of a couple guests ago, Mae Young, who wrote a book on lament. I don't know if you all have seen that. I thought it was pretty good. Recommend that. I also want to give a shout out to my Canadian co-host here, since your hockey travels. Did you spend any time in Canada doing the hockey stuff?
Yeah, so my dad is Canadian. He's from Edmonton,
Okay.
Alberta, and he played hockey at the University of Alberta.
Awesome. Lisa first, and then Taylor, you're welcome to chime in. Anything you're willing to share about spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines that sustain you now?
Sure. I think one of my favorite things is to ask God a question, ask him for guidance on something, and then just wait. And so I have notepads all over my house, pads and pens, and just waiting on God. And the funny thing is that he often gives me the answer while I'm driving or in the shower where there are not notepads. So that is one of my spiritual practices, is timing, hearing from God, and then being able to write it down before I forget.
Lisa, I wish we were in person. Like, I just bought on Facebook Marketplace like a whole bin because my daughter loves to draw. So I just bought like a whole bin of like notepads and journals. So I could hook you up with some notepads.
That would be great. I need a waterproof one for the shower. So if you come up with that, let me know.
Taylor, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the normal things, but I think what has been particularly sweet in this season is for the first time, a lot of my growing up years, I didn't go to a particularly liturgical church, and our church here in Charlottesville does have more liturgical rhythms and practices, and I have found that to be really grounding. And in the past few years, we've had seasons of really great joy and really great sorrow, and I think to show up relatively week in and week out and to be saying the same things about God has been really helpful. And for other people to give me words when words have been hard has been really helpful. And that's a practice I wouldn't have known I needed 5 years ago.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Again, certainly my colleague who's Anglican in Canada would appreciate. It's an important thing, I think, when, like you said, we don't have the words, we don't know what to say. Those kind of prayers can help us stay connected to God. Well, let's jump in right away, just because for sake of time. Taylor and Lisa are the authors of a book, or I guess you're the editors, right?
Yes, we have about 20 authors, and we did write some of the chapters, but we have a whole team of trauma experts and writers with us.
Yeah. The book is Skills for Safeguarding, a Guide to Preventing Abuse and Fostering Healing in the Church. I think an incredibly important conversation in light of all that's happened over the last, the 21st century. I feel like every few years it's just another awful story of churches and institutions and church leaders like just abandoning, just doing completely wrong things. And I think one of the things that first struck me when I read the book, this was early on in the book, y'all write, or I guess one of your authors, right? But this quote struck me about how one of the most effective ways to prevent abuse is by seeking leaders with integrity. And I think it seems so obvious to me, but again and again, I see this repeated, is we do the opposite. So I just wonder, like, what is that? What gets in the way of that? Because it seems so basic, but so far from what actually gets put into practice.
Yeah, I think one of the things that gets in the way is the fact that religion is a business, and that leaders who are charismatic, motivational speakers, and can draw a big audience and increase attendance are the ones that are beneficial for increasing bottom line. And so I think that that's where there's a conflict between character and charisma and what is driving the church in terms of mission.
I think too, there can be this kind of, we can really buy into the mantra that the ends justify the means, that we can have this, godly goal of more people coming to church. We want the church to have a good reputation in the community. We want people to think that we are friendly and charming, and like more people come to know Jesus, and we think that we can kind of cut corners in pursuit of that goal, that efficiency is the highest good. And Scripture never claims that efficiency is the thing we should pursue at any cost. And I think that's one of the hard things, is integrity is proven over time and is slow and steady, and faithfulness over a long period of time. And we often don't want to prove that out.
Yeah. A spiritual director once told me, and I think it's very much true, that when, I want to get the order right, when the ends justify the means become the ends. And I feel like that there's a lot of correlation here between what y'all are talking about.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we can't pursue godly goals by ungodly means. Like, that is not pleasing to God, and people are harmed.
Yeah. This reminds me of something I saw on social media. I hadn't seen it in a few years, and I'm kind of disheartened to see it again. I don't know if y'all seen it, this like thing that pastors will be like, we'll stop anywhere, we'll go all the way right up to sin, like just short of sin. And I'm like, no, like, let's back the train up far from sin.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit scary, but I think that, the crux of the New Testament is, okay, we don't want to just don't break the law. We want to go beyond that. We want to move towards love and truth and goodness and compassion and mercy. So that's the opposite direction, saying that we're going to go up to the line of sin.
Yeah, I feel like I heard like a sermon or two on that in my youth group days, right? Of don't doing that. Taylor, you use the word reputation, and it stood out to me because I think one of the things that is in the book is y'all distinguish between a church as an institution and the church as people of God. And there's tends to be this, especially amongst bigger churches or institutions, Christian institutions, this like, we got to protect the brand. Like, we got to protect the image. We got to protect, as you use the word, reputation. Like, what's the significance of distinguishing the church as a people of God versus the church as an institution?
Yeah. We're by no means anti-local church. We're very, very pro local church. But when we elevate the, how do I want to phrase this? What comes to mind is when Jesus said, man was not built for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was built for man. I'm sure there's a theologian listening to this that would give protest, but we were not like built to raise up a brand of the church. The church was designed for our flourishing and for God's glory. And so when it's not serving those purposes, it's not existing as God's designed the church to be. And so I don't feel a burden to preserve that particular institution, that particular local church, or that particular brand. And God's kingdom, God's whole universal church, God's care for the Christian church as a whole is not threatened by a particular institution experiencing a reckoning of sorts when they have harmed people.
Yeah, Lisa, I feel like I just saw something on this on social media or somewhere about like, I think it was like Hillsong, New York, or, these really big dynamic mega churches where they're like demanding their volunteer staff just work insane hours for free at the sake of like boosting the image and reach of the church. Certainly what comes to mind is, the Mars Hill podcast and some of those dynamics. Like, I mean, I think this is what I really want to ask about, Lisa. I think it's so easy for us to look at those mega church examples and think, oh, we would never let that happen in our context, a smaller, like normative sized church. What do you think are some of the ways that even in a smaller church, like the median church is like 65 people, like that the median sized church can protect the institution at the sake of the people of God?
So I think it comes down to, are we valuing the individual? and the value of the least of these among our congregations compared to the branding and mission of the church itself. And I think Diane Langberg said that Jesus did not go to the cross for the church. He went to the cross for people. And over and over, we see in Old and New Testament the value of people that may not be able to even give much or serve much, but how those are valuable to God. And so I think that even in small churches and large churches, once we start valuing the institution itself, then everyone can close ranks around the leader and around the image, as opposed to protecting and valuing the least of these and individuals.
Yeah, that's good. So in the book, y'all propose what you highlight or what you term a tripod of relational safety. Taylor, do you want to start by walking us through what that tripod of relational safety looks like?
Yeah, so this was developed by Dr. DiLiaco at the Catholic Safeguarding Institute, and it comprises of three things: safe self, safe community, and safe ministry. And so it highlights that we can't have safe ministry if we first don't bear some individual responsibility to be safe people, that we have to engage with what we as counselors call our own reactivity. Where am I prone to experience a larger emotional response to like daily things? Where do I feel defensive? Where do I feel outsized anger when I feel slighted? Where am I prone to feel insecure and maybe seek validation from other people who aren't in roles that need to be giving me validation? Those are really, really important things to dive into, because that's where we're vulnerable to use our power to harm others and not to serve others. And once we've taken on that individual responsibility to be a safe person, to build a safe self, we can be in safe community with others. We can build safe relationship with one another, where we can hold one another accountable, that we can kind of hold the mirror up to one another to see these things and build these kind of reciprocal relationships, these back and forth relationships. Out of that safe community, then we can engage in safe ministry to the vulnerable. That oftentimes we just dive into serving the vulnerable out of good intentions, but we've done no meaningful reflection on what's going on in me that might prompt me to use this role in a way that actually could harm people.
Yeah, Lisa, talk about what can happen when like those three parts aren't working together in harmony.
I think first people have to understand what safety is. So I think we first go to, well, we're a safe church, meaning physically safe. And so, yes, of course, keeping people physically safe is important. But I think understanding what emotional safety means as well. And that when we are talking about trauma, we can re-traumatize people that are trauma survivors by not understanding the words that we're using. So I think that you have to understand what safety is to really understand this diagram that intersects the self, the community, and the ministry. Because if you have any of those parts off, like starting with ourselves, we have to be a safe person to ourselves and to others. And then that is going to impact the ministry and the community. And if safety is missing in any fashion in any one of those, it's going to affect the culture across the board.
I'm glad you mentioned the point about emotional safety, because I think that can be a trend in some church spaces where there's this like for good reason, this want to have authenticity and vulnerability, but at some point, like, personal boundaries matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly.
Yeah, personal boundaries matter. And even things, churches are a big hugging community.
Right.
I'm a big hugger, but
I am not a hugger. So if we met, like, I'm a handshake. I grew up Baptist.
Right. So if I run across the room to you with my arms wide open, you are probably going to feel less safe.
Yeah.
Just recognizing, like you said, people's boundaries. And I think it's the humility that will drive us to want to adjust our own words and behaviors for the sake of others. And maybe some people are going to have pushback after politically correctness and then led to cancel culture. And I'm not saying that we need to treat everybody like they're a snowflake, but I think that there's a respect that we can give people. There's a respect that we can give women in the way they're talked about. There's a respect with children. There's a respect with people with disabilities. Like, I think that it's the vulnerable people that are at the most risk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Lauren, I'm glad you mentioned the kind of prizing authenticity and sharing, which is a good value. It's a meaningful thing, but there also can be a demand of share
Right.
all of yourself immediately
Right.
when you enter into a community without the natural relationship trust building that should be the foundation of that kind of emotionally intimate sharing. And that's one of the things that we try to engage with in the book of what are these foundational skills that would be helpful for people in the church to know as they're trying to build safe relationships, safe, trusting relationships with people so that they over time feel safe to share of themselves. Not because trauma survivors or people in general owe us all aspects of their really, really
Right.
vulnerable stories.
Yeah, I feel like I think that's a great point about mutual respect. Like, I feel like that's such a basic biblical, like, I'm Googling Romans 12:10, like, seems like the obvious scripture comes to mind to that point. But like you said, that can be, well, let's not go too deep into that. But I'm glad you're making that emphasis and understanding the point about boundaries or emphasizing the point about boundaries. I want to talk similar to about boundaries and often the annihilation of boundaries, depending on how powerful the person is. Power dynamics. Why is awareness of power so essential? And why is this so hard to navigate oftentimes in churches? And let me maybe preface it by this way. So I've worked in evangelical and mainline church contexts, and mainline churches often do like a really good job of having solid professional boundaries, but oftentimes there's this like big disconnect, it seems like relationally, from the clergy person and the congregation. Whereas like what I've seen in evangelical churches, in my experience and others, is like there can be almost this really melding a relationship, which can go really sideways. Talk about those power dynamics and what that can look like. Lisa, do you want to start?
Yeah. So first, everyone has power. There's just varying degrees, and it's impacted by the positions and roles we play with each other. And so I've heard people argue when we're talking, for example, about treating trauma survivors and the various situations, people might argue the fact and say, oh, well, they were two consenting adults, without understanding positionally how this impacts the relationship. So if somebody has influence over another, it could be because they are a supervisor, because they have hiring and firing potential, because they are older, because they are wiser and more mature as opposed to a younger person whose brain isn't fully developed yet. Whatever the reason is, anybody that has more significant influence over the other person creates a power differential. And when there's a power differential, it's always the responsibility of the person with more power to ensure safety for both of them. And so that's why even with two consenting adults, that you can still have abuse of power, you can still have spiritual abuse, you can have sexual abuse because of these power dynamics at play. And so whether it's a pastor to a congregant, which is even illegal in some states, whether it's an adult to a child, and even if that child, in my opinion, has turned 18 and the adult is 38, that's a power differential.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we've labeled things as affairs that are actually abuse due to power differentials. So I think that's a really important concept to first understand, and that although everyone does have a degree of power and should participate in safeguarding, there really is a big difference when people have more influence over others.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Lisa. Taylor, talk about how churches can navigate in a healthy way, the mutual relationships, but also respecting those power differences.
Yeah. So, this question brings to mind the passage in Philippians 2 about Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, emptied himself and took on the form of a servant. There's that kind of, we are trying to follow the model of Christ here, that though we have power, we are using our power to serve. And our autopilot tendency is not going to be to use our power to serve. Our autopilot tendency is going to be to use our power to meet our own needs. And that can cause a lot of harm. And so we, within the church, there has to be a really, really intentional effort to recognize the positions that we're in. And this is something that we have to navigate as counselors all the time. Like, as counselors, we are in positions of significant power and significant influence with our clients. And so it is really openly discussed that that we're trying to build collaborative relationships, that there is a differential here, and how can we help you be empowered to make more choices? And so I think that that's part of what would be valuable within church spaces, that it be part of the open conversation, that church pastors, elders, deacons are having conversations within their church about how they're exercising influence, and that they are acknowledging that they're wanting to use that power to empower others.
Yeah, let's stay on that for a moment, if I may, because certainly, I mean, there is some measure of authority, I think another word for power, right?
Mhm.
From a clergy person or a church leader, and they want to use their influence, their authority to influence someone for the sake of the gospel, to become a follower of Jesus, to become a more closely disciple of Jesus, like, there is, like, correct me if I'm wrong here, if you disagree, like, there can be some good use of that power, yes?
Yeah, certainly.
What does Lisa, like, what would you tell, like, a church leader or a pastor when that leadership or that influence or that authority is going sideways?
I would say that influence, when it involves control, coercion, and manipulation, is always sideways. And Jesus
Hold on,
did
I'm writing
not
that down. Control, coercion.
and manipulation.
Okay.
It's always sideways at that point, because Jesus did not impose on us to obey. He called us, he invited us, he spoke truth, and he modeled it. He did not force, he did not micromanage.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's stepping over the line when spiritual leaders are trying to tell people what they have to do. And they weaponize shame to get people to do what they want, even if it's for good. Even if the goal, I mean, we've seen this in the purity culture movement,
Right.
where, yes, sexual purity is a good thing, but the means don't justify the end here. Because if we are manipulating and forcing and weaponizing shame to get people to obey the gospel, we're not operating in righteousness and following the model of Jesus in terms of how we use our own power.
You mentioned shame, and I want to jump to that because I think it's such an important part of this conversation. I'm going to read I'm going to read a quote here directly from the book. It says there's a definitive distinction between shame and guilt. Guilt is the emotional response to regrettable actions or behaviors that were perceived as wrong or inconsistent with values and can lead to a necessary repair of the offense. Shame is a self-devaluing emotional response integrated into one's identity and self-worth due to perceptions of the self as bad, sinful, unlovable, dirty, or other deplorable traits. Shame is intrinsically painful and emotionally dysregulating. Talk more, Taylor, about how that dynamic gets played out in unhealthy ways, that distinction.
Yeah. So this distinction is really important because, there's that verse in 2 Corinthians about godly grief leading to repentance that leads to salvation and worldly grief leading to death. And I think that's the
Mm-hmm.
distinction we're talking about is guilt is an important emotion and one we should grow to tolerate because it leads us to recognize the ways that we are making choices that harm ourselves and harm others. And we can move toward God and others in repair and in repentance. And so guilt, when we learn how to respond to it rightly, moves us toward connection. Shame tells us that we are broken, that we are wholly unlovable, that we are wholly bad. And it prompts us to move away from God and others in disconnection. And so the outcome is like polar opposites. Do we notice something that we've done that's bad and move toward others in connection? Or do we notice something that we've done that's bad and move toward hiding?
Lisa, I'm curious about this too. You mentioned purity culture as an example of an unhealthy practice of shame versus guilt. I'm wondering, like, I'm thinking about this too when we think about, 2020 and so much of the Black Lives Matter and this need for conciliation among, especially towards people of color in our nation. But there's very much a backlash in many instances. And I'm wondering, like, do you think that shame and guilt sometimes don't get distinguished well enough? Like, cause again, like you say in the, like it said in the book, like, I think that's an important point of saying, like, I think Martin Luther King did this, saying, like, nation, we are guilty of not living up to our values, but that doesn't mean like we're terrible people.
Mm-hmm. I think that the definitions definitely are misunderstood and misused. And I think, as counselors, I think that most of us have a different understanding or a more clear understanding of this because it comes up so much in the work that we do. And in fact, we find most people that are stuck in mental health issues related to their trauma, it's not so much the traumatic event that happened, it's the shame that was associated with it. And it's the shame that often came from the people that they thought would be their support system.
Right.
And so we could see this in the church, that as we go to the church with our struggles, if we are met with "you're bad" and shunned and our community is pulled away from us and things like that, instead of focusing on the behaviors, because all have sinned. And so I think that that's the key, to really understand that guilt is an internal conviction. It's the behavior was wrong, I should change the behavior. And shame is I am bad or you are bad. And then the consequences of that, again, are withdrawing from community, almost like a leprosy. And that does not restore someone, that destroys someone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think to your point, Loren, this kind of guilt versus shame dynamic doesn't just happen in trauma survivors. It happens in all of us. And when there's an instance of injustice in our church where maybe we write about complicity in the book where, abuse is not just an offender. There's a whole system around the offender that enables abuse. And when we recognize our role in enabling abuse, we might feel prone to feel shame. And out of that shame, we could be further complicit. We could say, let's just move toward grace. Let's move toward forgiveness because I don't want to address my real feeling of guilt and move toward reconciliation because I can't tolerate how uncomfortable this feeling is. And so we just need to make it go away. And so I think it's important for all of us, not to just say guilt and shame is a trauma survivor feeling, but for all of us to learn how to respond to the feeling of guilt so that we don't find ourselves shame spiraling because we can't attune to that feeling and move toward repentance and repair.
That's interesting that you mentioned that about feelings of shame, people feeling the anxiety and wanting that kind of fix or immediate relief of, well, let's push for grace and forgiveness. Certainly there's too many examples, right, of churches immediately asking someone who's been offended, like to offer grace and to extend forgiveness. I'm not sure what the question asked, but what more do you want to add to that? It's such a heavy conversation there.
I think that one thing that I would add, just like it says in Romans 6, is that grace is not a license to sin. And it's certainly not a license to harm other people. And so if we're going to have a culture of both compassion and clear boundaries, we need to understand the purpose of grace. True grace invites transformation. It invites change towards righteousness. It is not avoidance of responsibility. And without acknowledgement of responsibility, there's no true repentance. And so all of this is connected. Forgiveness is not something that anyone should ever be forced to do. That it actually doesn't make it forgiveness. It just makes it an acceptance of an apology. But again, grace is not something that we can use as a tool to avoid responsibility, to avoid those feelings of shame, to avoid any of our uncomfortableness, and to allow sin to flourish.
I can't remember if it was in this book or somewhere else. Oh, yes. Here on 226, forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. No victim should ever be forced to reconcile with the perpetrator. I think this is a really helpful distinction because I think about, I wrote about this in a Substack myself. Like, I have someone harm me in life in a ministry setting. Like, I've forgiven them, or at least I'm very much trying to practice the 70 times 7, right? Of when that bitterness comes up, still trying to forgive them, right? But I don't necessarily want to go make friends with them again, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's that kind of trust building that we talked about earlier, that if there is, in cases of abuse, there's so many layers of deception and wickedness that goes into a person harming another person in such a profound way. And so there should always be safeguards and always be layers of accountability around another person who has harmed someone in such a profound way. But even in what you're describing, there's like this kind of, I don't know the details of it, but like, if there have not been any movement toward trust building, there's wisdom in being cautious about what the relationship looks like, because you're also protecting them from sinning against you again. Like it could be loving toward them to be wise about how much access they have.
Yeah, let's stay on that for a moment here real quick, because, gosh, I want to try to find the quote, but y'all say something is in the book about grace being good boundaries, and I thought that was quite interesting. Lisa, do you want to comment to that?
Yeah, well, first I wanted to say that forgiveness does not mean restoration of relationship. Those are two very different things.
Yeah.
And somebody can fully forgive someone and never be in contact with them again. And so I think we do need to separate out forgiveness as a letting go and turning it over to God, as opposed to being the one to harbor all the negative feelings and thoughts over and over. But being in relationship with somebody is completely separate. And that's where it's important for people that have suffered abuse to know that you can forgive and you do not have to ever talk to that person again if that is not a person that is going to be safe ongoing.
Yeah.
So that is an important differentiation. I forgot what you asked. So maybe Taylor can with a question.
Yeah, I think, Loren, you were talking about
Grace and
boundary
boundaries.
setting,
Yeah.
particularly with offenders. And I think that's where the quote was coming from. And,
Right.
One of the things I think where this kind of grace and accountability, like rushing to that place, can come from is, someone finds out that someone they really loved and trusted has caused such significant harm. And that's really, really dysregulating. That's so disorienting. It's confusing. And you just want everything to go back to how it was. You want everything to be okay again. You want everything, like everyone to be okay. And you want life and relationships to make sense again. And so there's this sense of like, let's rush to make it make sense again. But that is not loving both to the victim, and that makes sense to all of us why that's not loving to the victim, but it's also not loving to the offender, because it harms us when we sin. It harms us when we cause harm to other people. It is loving to an offender to protect them and help them see the natural consequences of their sin with the hope that it would lead them to repentance. And so for us to protect offenders from the consequences of their sin doesn't do them any favors. It's not loving, and it just glosses things over. And we shroud it with Christian language and call it loving, but it really harms everyone involved.
Yeah, this is great stuff here. I'm hearing a lot of family systems theory in your thinking here. I'm not sure if that's intentional, but certainly, yeah, it resonates. Well, one more question here before we take a break. If y'all could give one first step a church could take or think about if they really want to be more intentional on creating safer and healthier churches, where could they begin? Lisa, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think starting with trainings on trauma and power differentials is one step forward in terms of creating awareness. So I'm a big proponent of education, and I think that that's a really good place to start, because if you don't understand the impact of abuse, the impact of trauma, how it creates a ripple effect across so many systems, and how there can be complicity, not just with the perpetrator, but also with the systems around, as we had mentioned. I think that that's a really important place to start before we go to building out procedural type of things. Of course, churches should have policies and that type of thing, but I think starting with the understanding of trauma and power is a really good place to start.
Yeah. Taylor, how about you?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think a lot of churches are realizing that they need some kind of safeguarding policy in place of how many nursery workers take a child to the bathroom, which again, super important, really, really valuable. But they end up starting and stopping with training the lowest level volunteer, and the leaders don't end up getting very much in-depth trauma training. And they're the ones who are doing a lot of the finding out about allegations of abuse and responding to allegations of abuse. And so this really starts with leadership. And again, those volunteer trainings are important and they could happen, but we need to start with leadership. And we intentionally designed our book with discussion questions. And so for a leadership team to to read the book together, to ask and answer discussion questions together, and look within themselves of, where is this sticking? What's hard about this? What am I noticing in myself? Where am I prone to use power in a way that harms in ways that could seem small? How can we develop a culture of self-reflection amongst our leadership team?
This really reminds me just to back to the beginning of our conversation, that this all takes time and energy and purpose that might be seen as a distraction from doing, reaching people or what have you. But we've got to understand, and I think this is the message y'all are trying to say, this is essential for the health and vitality of the church, long term. So again, the book is Skills for Safeguarding, a Guide to Preventing Abuse and Fostering Healing in the Church. Really recommend it. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Dr. Lisa Compton and Taylor Patterson. Really appreciate this conversation. Grateful for y'all's perspectives. Okay, so the closing questions, you're welcome to take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. You can respond both or skip, whatever you want to do. But if you're Pope for a day, what would that day look like? What might you want to do? Anything you want to accomplish? Thinking about having significant influence somewhere.
Well, I'll keep it relevant to what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
I would love every single church and every single ministry to have a safeguarding team that did not have leadership on their team.
Oh.
So separate. The safeguarding team should be trained and they should be separate from the leadership. So if I were Pope, that would be one of the first things that I did.
That's good. Taylor?
Yeah, Lisa's a visionary. My first thought was, yikes. I don't know that I want to be Pope for the day. So what goes on in me is, wow, I just hope I don't break anything, and want to model faithful, ordinary service to the least of these, because I think most of what I want is not accomplished in a day, but maybe that helps move the needle in normal, ordinary servant leadership.
Those are great. Those are both great answers. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life. Let's go reverse here. Taylor, then Lisa.
Yes, so this might be a little cliche, but C.S. Lewis has been a companion through so many phases of my Christian life that has been really sweet. So to continue companioning with him would be sweet. The other that comes to mind is Nathan. We wrote about him in the Safeguarding book in his confrontation of King David, and it was just so courageous. And I would be curious what he would say about our current time and the current place we find ourselves.
Yeah. Lisa?
I actually struggled with this question, maybe because I am not great at history and that was triggering. I don't know. But the one person that came to mind was Kenneth Hagin, because early on, back in the day, obviously, that's who I listened to and read his books. And he even came to one of the churches that I was at the time. And he didn't even have to open a Bible. And this is before we had screens in the back, but would just cite like an entire chapter of a Bible by memory. So he was really one of the great inspirations for me in terms of teaching and knowledge of the Bible. So that would be my pick.
Yeah. What do you think history will remember, Lisa, from this current time and place? And I guess I'm giving you another hard answer here, hard question.
It is hard because, it's almost like with COVID, when we were in COVID, it was really hard to see, like, when we look back in history, what are we going to think about it? And
right.
I feel like it's kind of the same. I can talk about where we've been. When I started counseling almost 30 years ago, we didn't talk about trauma. Like, trauma was thought of as rare. And so, we've seen so much change over the past decades. Right now, I feel like we're in the season of it's getting stirred up. And so people are getting held accountable. Things are being called out on social media. For me, that doesn't love conflict. It's uncomfortable, but I know that it's good and it's moving towards change. So I feel like the current state it's all coming to light and being stirred up, and hopefully we're going to see the shaking settle towards real significant change.
Yeah, good. Taylor?
Yeah, I would echo that. From the optimistic part of me says the pro is that this would be seen as like a time of reckoning that leads to fruit, like watching things are coming out, and hopefully that is good for the church. The part of me that's like, the con side, I guess, is that this is a time of such intense polarization, and we are, there's purity tests on either side, and that are loud and hard and intense, and but then I feel there's nothing new under the sun, and faithful Christians have navigated seasons of instability and polarization for a long, long time. So maybe none of those things. Maybe it'll be something different. But
well, let's end on this more hopeful. What do you hope for the future of Christianity, Taylor?
Yeah, I hope that as the dust settles on the reckoning, that we grow to be known for ordinary, faithful service, that we love God and love our neighbor, and that comes to be what the church is known for, rather than what it feels like the church is known for now, that is scandal and harm and abuse and injustice.
Yeah. Lisa?
This one was really hard because there's so many things I would want to add, but I think number one, I'd like to see power more shared as opposed to an all focus on one leader in the church. I'd like to see more shared power, and I'd like to see more focus on formation early on in training programs, whether it's seminaries or whatever it is, where we're not just doing work on theology, but we're also engaging with our past stories, increasing our own self-awareness, understanding how as our roles and powers increase, there's going to be more pressure and more anxiety. And what does our own dysregulation look like, and how do we deal with it? So that's where I think safeguarding has to start. And that's one of the reasons why we made this into something that is could be a textbook, because we really want it to be a tool, information. And so I think it does start there, that we need to take some of the pressure off the leaders. Like, we love pastors and priests and leaders, and so we're not against them. I think that there's too much pressure on them to be all things to all people. And I think the power needs to be spread out, and we all need to be able to engage with our own stories.
Well, this has been good stuff. I'm really thankful for the conversation. Grateful that we could make this work, and again, grateful for the book, and I hope it's a help for others. Do you want to share anything about like where folks can connect with you, all that stuff?
I think the easiest for me is my website, drlisacompton.com.
I'm not terribly public, but we have a website for the book too. Skillsforsafeguarding.com has information about the book, and you can put a little message in there that connects with us too.
Okay, website's Dr. Lisa Compton and the Skills website. Okay, well, again, thank you so much for the conversation. Appreciate your making this work with me, and we always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.